You are listening to the Middle East Institute's podcast series. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.
It is far past time for the nations of the world to confront another reckless regime, one that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing death to America, destruction to Israel, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this room. The Iranian government masks a corrupt dictatorship behind the false guise of a democracy.
Hi, this is Paul Salem from the Middle East Institute. Welcome to our podcast, Middle East Focus. That was President Donald Trump at the UN General Assembly this week, where he focused much of his Middle East portion of the speech on attacking Iran. Here with me today to discuss Trump's speech and all things UNGA-related is Ambassador Jerry Feierstein, currently the Director of Gulf Affairs and Government Relations at the Middle East Institute, and Mr. Ahmad Majidyar, Director of our Iran Observed project. Welcome, friends, and let's get right into it. Jerry, what was your overall takeaway and impression about the speech?
Well, my overall thought about the speech was that, one, I think a number of people have noticed that there are major issues that are traditionally in the president's comments, like the Israel-Palestine issue, that were absent this time. But the larger takeaway for me was that once again, Donald Trump made a speech that was almost entirely focused on U.S. hard power, talking about destroying North Korea, talking about confronting Iran, and very little, almost nothing that really talked about diplomatic strategies or anything that might be a soft power approach to some of these challenges.
Ahmad, what was your first reaction?
Yeah, I think that the president raised some strong points. He highlighted some key global challenges and called on the UN and other member states to do more to tackle and address them. But I think overall it was not the right speech at the right place. It was President Trump's first speech at the UN, and I think he should have used that opportunity to talk about the American leadership in the world and the need for international cooperation to tackle global challenges rather than focusing on America First policies. In addition, while I think the president rightly drew attention to international threats posed by North Korea and Iran, which was the central part of his speech, he did not present a clear pathway to how to work with the international community to tackle those problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what struck me, on a speech to the United Nations, he emphasized nationalism and sovereignty, whereas the UN and the international order after World War II was built on internationalism and multilateralism. And they were established to end wars between countries that had exaggerated nationalism and sovereignty. So that was something I tweeted on the day. Jerry, your thoughts on that?
I think, he talked an awful lot about how countries pursue their own national interest and used a number of examples going all the way back to World War II. But I think that the word that was missing from his phrase was enlightened self-interest, enlightened national interest, and the idea that you need a broader interpretation of what is in the national interest in order to pursue. So cooperation with partners, with allies, is an important part of national interest. You are trying to achieve your objective, but you understand that in order to do that, you need to cooperate and you need to compromise.
Let's zero in on the Middle East portion of this speech. Other than Iran, Ahmad, which we will get to, what did he talk about relating to the Middle East? What were the themes? What was in, what was out?
He did talk about the war on terrorism, but did not discuss the war against the ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And also, although the ISIS is losing ground in both countries, the war there is far from over. And I thought that he would talk about the post-conflict reconstruction and also making sure that the conditions that allowed ISIS to emerge are not there. But he didn't talk about that. Another issue that he addressed was the refugee issue. He made two claims. One, that he said that it's safe and humanitarian and responsible to keep the refugees as close as to their home countries. And I think that was not an accurate claim because...
Well, he did talk in a significant portion about the humanitarian issue, refugees. He thanked Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan for hosting them. I was positively surprised that he gave humanitarian issues, refugees, a decent portion of his Middle East speech. That kind of surprised me, while he left out things like the Israel-Palestine conflict, didn't mention Yemen, didn't mention Libya. So I took a little bit of a positive takeaway from that. Do you share that impression?
No, I think that, yeah, of course, he thanked Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon. But if the United States is not sharing the burden on just taking in refugees, then it would be difficult for the administration to convince its partners, including those countries, to do their part.
Well, I counted, and I want, Jerry, your views, 6 issues that he mentioned relating to the Middle East. Iran, which we'll get to. The war on Islamic terror, and he insists on using that, which is fine. Afghanistan. He mentions Iraq, Syria, in passing without much detail. He mentions again weapons of mass destruction, the chemical weapons use in Syria and the strike. And he mentions humanitarian issues. So 6 issues. What is left? What's the importance of what he left out?
Well, the importance of what he left out is that he really did not discuss or disclose in any particular detail what exactly he intended to do about any of those things. So he talked about the humanitarian issue, as Ahmad said, but the irony that many people have noticed is that while he boasted about U.S. commitments and U.S. contributions to humanitarian relief over the years, many of the programs that he was talking about are savaged in his own budget proposal. So he wants to take away the money that's supporting that. He doesn't talk at all about diplomatic strategies. He condemned Bashar al-Assad's regime, fairly enough. Nobody disagrees with that. But he didn't talk at all about what he intends to do about it. And in fact, what we've seen over these last months is an administration which has basically walked away from any idea, any concept of regime change in Damascus, or anything that would really basically address the problem of governance in Syria. So in all of these issues, the rhetoric simply is not matched by the reality.
Mm-hmm. But he did, and we'll get onto the issue of Iran, the rhetoric on Iran approached sort of regime change type rhetoric as relates to Iran. It reminded me a bit of the George W. Bush's Axis of Evil speech. He put things in terms of we are facing an evil, the countries of the world should, face down evil. And he's clearly naming North Korea, Iran, and he's added Venezuela to the list, and Cuba to some degree.
It's a new axis of evil,
A new axis. But let's get to the Iran situation. Let's hear what President Trump had to say about the nuclear deal.
We cannot abide by an agreement if it provides cover for the eventual construction of a nuclear program.
Well, that was pretty straightforward, Ahmad, and there was a lot on Iran, several passages on Iran. First of all, summarize for us what he said on Iran. What are the positions that came out in the speech vis-a-vis Iran? What's new and what's not new?
Yeah, he repeated that he doesn't like the Iran nuclear agreement, and the agreement needs to be either fixed, renegotiated, or it has to be canceled. I think that President Trump left no doubt in his UN speech that he will not certify Iran's compliance with the nuclear agreement, which is due next month. Decertification doesn't necessarily mean that U.S. is walking away from the deal, so the administration will most likely leave it to Congress to decide whether the United States should remain a party to the deal or not.
Well, how does that play out, Jerry? Let me get your views. First of all, what do you think the White House is going to do? President Trump said he's made up his mind. He won't tell anybody what that is.
Which seemed to surprise even
the
Secretary of State. But,
true. Yeah. What are the options that the White House might be thinking of, and how would it play out, particularly with Congress and in the context of an international agreement?
Well, as Ahmed said, the act of decertification doesn't necessarily mean in and of itself that you've abrogated the JCPOA. What it does is it sets a 60-day clock in motion for the Congress to act on the basis of the president's decision. The Congress may decide a number of things. They may decide to impose new sanctions that, in fact, do abrogate the JCPOA that would be related to the nuclear file. They could decide to impose new sanctions that don't abrogate the JCPOA. In other words, they could take action on sanctions related to the ballistic missile issue, to support for terrorism, for some of the other behavior issues that the president objects to, and leave it at that. And in fact, as you know, the Congress just a few months ago actually did impose new sanctions on Iran for several of those same issues.
Well, let me ask you, is there a way for the White House to decertify, but the U.S. stay in the deal?
Yes, absolutely. The U.S. could stay in the deal if the Congress decided, again, that they were either going to impose new sanctions that didn't violate the terms of the JCPOA or conceivably do nothing, although I think it's hard to understand how they would decline to respond at all to a presidential decertification. The other issue, of course, is that there are some who have suggested a third way, which is that within the context of the 60-day clock, the president may negotiate with our European partners, even with the Iranians, to try to address some of the details of the JCPOA that he finds objectionable. And if there were to be an agreement on, for example, extending the sunset clauses of the agreement or taking harsher measures in terms of inspections, that the president
could declare that a victory.
He could then declare it a victory and certify.
Art of the deal. Ahmad, you're following this very closely as well. So what are your thoughts on what might happen on the U.S. side of things before getting to the Iran side?
No, I totally agree with Jerry that even if the Trump administration decertifies Iran's compliance, it does not end the deal. And it will be up to the Congress to decide on that. Although the Iran issue is a bipartisan issue in the Congress. And many of the members of the Congress and also senators as well who objected to the nuclear deal at the first place, they are now advocating for keeping the deal, but at the same time working with European allies and other willing international partners to address some of the loopholes that Jerry talked about. One of the key loopholes in the deal is that some of its sunset provision that allows Iran to resume its nuclear program after a decade. And another issue is that Iran's controversial ballistic missile program is not part of the nuclear deal. It is mentioned in the United Nations Security Council resolution, but it's not an obligation. Only the languages that it calls upon Iran not to test ballistic missile.
How are you reading the European obviously they're not happy, I would think, with the position the president has staked, but he is the president of the United States, and, they're dealing with that. I saw a statement from President Macron, I think, that indicated some wiggle room. Ahmad, have you seen something in the European position, or how do you read it currently?
Yeah, I was watching the General Assembly and also the sideline meetings very closely. And the leaders of Germany, France, and Britain, the three countries that are signatory to the Iran deal, they made it clear that they want to keep the Iran deal. They don't want to abrogate it, and they want to implement it. So they did not agree with the Trump administration that Iran is in violation of the nuclear agreement. But on the other hand, these European countries and many countries around the world, they share the administration's concern about Iran's missile program as well as Iran's malign activities in the region. So that's why it's important for the administration not to isolate itself, but work with its European partners to address those concerns.
Jerry, you've been in the State Department for many years, I might venture. How might the U.S. politically manage this process with its allies, given the timelines, given the different positions staked out? Is there a pathway?
Well, I think you mentioned the reaction of the French President Macron, which was certainly opening the door a crack to an initiative, to a willingness to work with President Trump on some kind of a process that might achieve the outcome that the administration desires. Whether Macron was reflecting also the views of Angela Merkel or Theresa May, and certainly whether he was reflecting the views of the Russians and the Chinese, is an open question. But it seemed that he was willing to at least entertain some process that might satisfy the president and might achieve his objectives.
So maybe looking for some middle
ground. Again, Macron was very clear that France does not support abrogating the JCPOA, that they continue to see it as a good agreement, but he also accepted President Trump's argument that it could and should be improved.
Interesting. Ahmad, Tehran, how have they reacted to all of this? President Rouhani, Foreign Minister Zarif have been involved in all of these meetings in New York and so on. What's the read? What options are open to President Rouhani and the Foreign Minister? Where does the Supreme Leader stand? How is this going down?
Yes, I've been following the Iranian reaction very closely indeed. And in Iran, the reformists and the hardliners often disagree on how to conduct domestic and foreign policy. But President Trump's speech brought a rare moment of unity inside Iran, because both the reformists and the hardliners, they blasted Trump's speech, because Iranians, after all, they're very nationalist people, and they're very proud people. So they didn't like what President Trump mentioned about it. I think that the President Rouhani and also Foreign Minister Zarif have hinted that the Rouhani administration wants to stay in the deal, even if the U.S. leaves it, and instead work with the Europeans and also China and Russia to minimize the impact of new U.S. sanctions. But if the Rouhani government chooses to do so, he will come under tremendous pressure from hardliners who opposed the nuclear deal at the very first place, because they were arguing that Tehran cannot trust Washington. Even after the deal, they were saying that the existing U.S. sanctions have not allowed Iran to benefit from the deal. So they didn't like the deal at the first place. But ultimately, the decision lies in the hands of Supreme Leader Khamenei.
Would you say there's any reality to not renegotiating, maybe negotiating some aspects of the deal, as, in a sense, President Macron might be hinting, maybe we can talk about something, maybe they understand President Trump needs a win, quote unquote, to claim that he did something, because as a candidate, he did promise that he was going to trash this deal. But it's also been clear that he's been reluctant to trash it. So maybe he needs, something to grasp onto. Is there anything that President Rouhani could get away with domestically?
One of the controversial issues now between Tehran and Washington is Iran's ballistic missile program. And Iranian leaders, both the political leaders and the military leaders, have been very clear that they don't want any negotiation over their ballistic missile program. President Rouhani has mentioned, and the IRGC leaders have mentioned as well. So I don't see any possibility of negotiation over those issues. Another clear issue of contention is the inspection of military sites. And again, I don't think that the IRGC and Supreme Leader Khamenei would allow President Rouhani to allow IAEA inspectors to come to the military sites. Now the question is that why Iran then, or Khamenei, allowed Rouhani in the first place to negotiate. Let's remember that Rouhani didn't do that because of a broader rapprochement with the United States. It was because of the crippling sanctions. And unless U.S. works with European allies to pressure Tehran, such renegotiation wouldn't be possible.
Thank you. Let's end with quick, if you had to give Jerry, if you had to give a recommendation to Secretary Tillerson, who's trying to manage this, what would it be?
Well, certainly, I think, and looking at it in the broader context of other issues that are going on in the world, I do think that it's still in the broader U.S. interest to find a way to continue to participate, continue to live up to the requirements of the JCPOA. I think, again, President Macron's advice was correct, that if there is going to be a collapse of the JCPOA, it should not come from the side of the five partners. It should come from Iran. Otherwise, the United States risks ending up isolated in the international community and seen as a rogue.
Thank you. Ahmad, your recommendation.
I absolutely agree with Jerry. I think that it's in the U.S. national security interest and also good for regional stability that the United States keeps the deal, but work with international partners to address concerns about Iran's nuclear activities and also subversive activities in the region.
Well, thank you very much. That's all the time we have. Thank you, Jerry, for joining us today. Thank you, Ahmad. And thank you all for listening. This issue will probably be escalating in the weeks and months ahead to see where it ends up. At a time when there, also is a major nuclear showdown with North Korea, we might be facing another crisis down the road. Hopefully that will not be the case. Thank you all for joining us. If you enjoyed tuning into this podcast, please log on to our Facebook site, facebook.com/Middle East Institute. Post comments, interact with us there, and also do like us. Thanks.